We are delighted to host today Professor Fabienne Peter. She's a professor of philosophy at the University of Warwick, and she's presenting today Runaway Reasons. Everyone should have a handout. Professor Peter, thank you so much for coming. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. For those of you who have perhaps read some of my previous work, I used to work primarily in political philosophy, primarily on political legitimacy, done some work on political epistemology, and sort of in epistemology more broadly. But increasingly, I've become interested in moral philosophy, including metaethics. And so I hope you forgive me if I'm going to test some new ideas out on you. So part of this new project, which really spans normative ethics as well as metaethics. The project can be described in different ways, but perhaps the best way is to say it's an ethics of fittingness that raises normative ethics questions about what are demands of fittingness, but it also raises metaethical questions. What's the relationship between fittingness and other normative properties and relation? What is fittingness in the first place? How does it relate to other normative properties and relation? And the paper here is part of that aspect of the project. Specifically, it's on the relationship between fittingness and reasons. So thank you for coming. It's great to be here. So to start, it's obvious that reasons are central to practical normativity. So the paper isn't perhaps quite as clear as it could be on this point. So I'm only going to talk about practical normativity, such as so related to what we have, what we ought to do, what are appropriate feelings, etc. So I'm not going to talk about epistemic normativity. So reasons are central to practical normativity. We see that obviously in the law context in which many of you work, right, central to legal normativity, and they are central to other aspects of practical normativity, such as the normativity of political legitimacy, I think. But if we understand practical normativity broadly, just how central are reasons? And the aim of my paper is to raise a challenge for a very common claim, the claim that normative reasons are the mark of the normative. I think Joseph Ranz has described this claim really well in Engaging Reason when he said that the normativity of all that is normative consists in the way it is or provides or is otherwise related to reasons. So whatever Raz's own view on this claim, it captures this idea that reasons are the mark of the normative. Whenever we talk about practical normativity, we're somehow involving reasons. The claim that reasons are the mark of the normative is primarily, well, is especially prominent in what has come to be known as the reasons first view of practical normativity. The reasons first view is, in the first instance, committed to an explanatory claim, the claim that normative reasons are explanatorily fundamental. That is, we can explain all other normative properties or relations in terms of reasons, but not vice versa. We can't explain them. I can't explain reasons in terms of them. So we can explain values in terms of reasons, but not reasons in terms of values. So that's the explanatory claim of the reasons first view. And then they hold that because of that explanatory claim, if all other normative properties and relations are explained in terms of reason, then obviously reasons are the mark of the normative because they inherit their normativity from reasons. However, there's a problem for the reasons first view. In fact, there are lots of problems. One prominent problem people have written a lot about is the wrong kind of reasons problem, which holds that, well, some normative reasons, or some reasons at least, appear to be wrong kind of reasons. They don't track these other normative properties or relations appropriately. So we may have reasons to admire an evil demon that don't track the admirability or the lack of admirability of that demon. These are wrong kind of reasons. If there are wrong kind of reasons, then it looks like the explanatory claim is false. And if the explanatory claim is false, if we can't appropriately explain all other normative properties and relations in terms of reasons, then it's possible that the normative claim is false too. We have to abandon it. Reasons need not be the mark of the normative. There are different solutions to the wrong kind of reasons problem. Some try to rescue the reasons first view by finding a way to distinguish between right kind and wrong kind of reasons within a reasons first view. Others look elsewhere. I think it's probably fair to say that Raz himself is drawn to a value first view, but others are drawn to a value first view, so try to explain reason on the basis of values and explain other normative properties and relations also on the basis of values. I'm one of these people who just don't understand values, or not really. I don't quite see them as the right sort of thing to explain normativity. So I favor a fittingness priority view. And others also have recently argued for a fittingness priority view, including a fittingness first view of practical normativity. But just the narrow claim I'm going to focus on, the fittingness priority view, is that normative reasons can be explained in terms of fittingness, but fittingness can't be explained in terms of reasons. Defenders of a fittingness priority view then often argue that one reason this view is attractive is that it helps with the wrong kind of reasons problem. Fittingness-based reasons are right kind of reasons. So if it's fitting to admire the evil demon, right, and you have a normative reason that is explained on the basis of the fittingness of this admiration, and then you don't have that gap that the reasons first view ends up in. And if we take that view on board, and I'm just going to take this as my starting point, if we accept the claim that maybe a fittingness priority view can help with the wrong kind of reasons problem, then we get a revised version of the normative claim I started out with. So not all normative reasons, or not all reasons are the mark of the normative, but specifically fittingness-based reasons. These are right kind of reasons, and right kind of reasons are the mark of the normative. And it's that revised claim that is the target of my paper. I want to show that, in fact, it's possible that there is a gap opening between fittingness-based reasons and right kind of reasons. That is, some fittingness-based reasons may still not be right kind of reasons, and that, understood in the right way, leads us to question the claim that reasons are the only mark of the normative. What I want to show is that there are some reasons that are fittingness-based, appropriately normative, but not right kind of reasons, and these are what I call runaway reasons. And if we have runaway reasons, then what happens is we have reasons that justify how we ought to respond to a given situation that don't pick out the fitting response. So we have a gap between the fitting response and what it looks like we have most reason to do. And if that's possible, if that tension between the normativity of reasons and the normativity of fittingness is possible, then it looks like that reasons are not the only mark of the normative. We need to consider the possibility of the normativity of fittingness to be in tension with the normativity of reasons. Okay, so that's where I want to end up with. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start just with some clarificatory remarks on fittingness and reasons. I then briefly summarize an account of reasons in terms of fittingness that I think is probably the most prominent of the most promising of the ones on offer. That's the one offered by Conor McHugh and Jonathan Way in their recent book, Getting Things Right. But I want to argue that they run into a problem with their explanation of reasons on the basis of fittingness. I then try to address this problem and provide an alternative account of the link between fittingness and reasons, which is what I call the linking principle, which doesn't run into the problems that their account runs into. I then briefly stop, but I probably don't have much time to consider an objection against all fittingness priority views of reasons, which is that fittingness is the wrong starting point for a theory of practical normativity because fittingness itself isn't appropriately normative. It's only thinly normative. So it doesn't give you the right sort of normativity to account for normative reasons. So I'm going to briefly mention this objection and how I think about avoiding it, and then introduce the idea of runaway reasons, and finally highlight the problem that this poses for our understanding of the revised normative claims that right kind of reasons, fittingness-based reasons, are the only mark of the normative. Okay, so fittingness and reasons. So my understanding of reasons is, I think, completely conventional. So a normative reason is a consideration in favor of some response. That's the Scanlonian view that we get from what we owe to each other. Yep, that's what it was called. So on that view that Scanlon develops there and in later writing, the reason relation is a relation between a fact P or a consideration P, some agent X, a response A, and some circumstances C. So if the plant on my desk needs watering, that is a reason that it needs watering, that consideration, that fact is a reason for me to water it in these circumstances. The fittingness relation is slightly different. So according to a sort of a fairly common gloss, fittingness is the relation in which an agent's response stands to an object or situation when the object or situation is worthy or merits that response. So the fittingness relation, unlike the reasons relation, is only a three-place relation between an agent, some circumstances, and the response that is fitting for that agent in those circumstances. So to clarify, in a lot of the literature today, people associate fittingness as something that only applies to attitudes, such as admiration or belief. I want to work with a broad understanding of fittingness, which is consistent with earlier uses of fittingness. For example, C.D. Broad had a broader understanding where fittingness also applies to action. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm only going to be talking about practical normativity, so I'm going to be talking about the fittingness of actions and of attitudes, feelings, but I'm going to bracket the fittingness of beliefs here for most part. So we have the reasons relation, a four-place relation between a consideration and some circumstances that apply to an agent and the possible response. So we're looking at favoring considerations, whereas with the fittingness relation, we're just looking at the relation between an agent, their response in given circumstances. Sometimes the way people describe fittingness is it's this response that a situation demands of an agent, right? So the fittingness and reasons can pick out the same response in a given scenario. Take a classic pond example. Suppose there's a child right in front of you at risk of drowning. Let's assume rescuing the child is the fitting response in this scenario. But of course, we also want to say you have reason to rescue the child, namely that it is at risk of drowning. So they point in the same direction, but they need not. And there's the fact that they can pick out the same response shouldn't mislead us into thinking that there is no daylight between the fittingness relation and the normative reasons relation. A key distinction, a key difference between the fittingness relation and the reasons relation is the fittingness relation, as I understand it, is an overall notion. So fittingness is an overall notion. It picks out the response that is merited, warranted, appropriate in given circumstances. There might be several responses, but they're not in conflict. In the pond example, it might also be fitting then to console the child, make sure it calms down, and so on. But they are not. So you can do all these things: rescue the child and console it. The reasons relation, by contrast, is different in this regard. Reasons are contributory. They operate together to help you determine how overall you ought to respond to in a given situation. So they are contributory and they can conflict. In the pond example, you obviously have a reason to rescue the child, which is that the child is at risk of drowning, but you also have a very weak, non-weighty reason not to jump in, not to rescue the child, which is that you'll get wet, right? The challenge I will press on is on that capacity of a fittingness-based account of explaining the way in which reasons compete. It's a key features of reasons that they compete. So they're contributory and they can conflict and they compete in the determination of what overall we ought to do. So that's just a quick comment on fittingness and reasons. Now, how should we understand the relation between fittingness and reasons if we take a fittingness priority view of reasons? As I mentioned, there are different proposals on the table. A particularly attractive one and well-developed one, book length one, is the one that we get from McHugh and Way in Getting Things Right. What I find attractive is that they offer a reasoning account. So they explain normative reason in terms of patterns of good reasoning. And it's a fittingness priority view because normative reasons on their account are premises in good patterns of reasoning that are fittingness preserving. That is, patterns of reasoning that start with fitting responses and end up in a fitting response. So here's an example, means end reasoning. So suppose it's fitting to intend E. Suppose you fittingly believe that some means is necessary for that end. It is then fitting to intend the means. In this pattern of reasoning, it's a good pattern of reasoning, standard means end reasoning. The end, the intention of the end, and the belief that and the necessary means, these are premises in this reasoning that give you normative reasons. So the example they use is, so suppose there's someone threatening bystanders with a gun, no relation to what I understand is happening perhaps right now, but in Oxford, but someone's threatening others, bystanders, with a gun. So suppose you fittingly intend to protect the bystanders. You fittingly believe that you need to disable the weapon in order to protect the bystanders. You fittingly take the means, that is, disable the weapon. Protecting the bystanders and intending to and disabling the weapons are premises in a good pattern of reasoning here. So far so good. It's a lot. The account has a lot going for it. However, I think it also has a problem. And the problem is that I think it struggles to account for the tendency of reasons to compete. It is compatible with the view that fittingness is an overall notion, and it certainly is compatible to shed some light on normative reasons, as the example I've just given you shows. In the pond example too, it can explain why you have reason to rescue the child, while that the child is at risk of drowning is a normative reason in this context. Where it struggles is with accounting for the reason that I postulated we have as well, applies as well in this context, the reason not to rescue the child, which is that you'll get wet. I think they struggle to give the right account for that reason, which also applies in this context. And the reason why they struggle is because they, on their account of reasoning, of normative reasons come out of a good pattern of reasoning that starts from a fitting response. But not wanting to get wet is not a fitting response in this scenario. So the whole story doesn't get off the ground, in my view. Now, it could be objected that this is too quick because they have long discussions of the possibility of reasoning being defeasible. That is, when you add premises, then a previously good pattern of reasoning turns into a bad pattern of reasoning. And that's fine. I think, of course, reasoning is defeasible in that way. I think that's an interesting story that they give. I think it sheds light on the weight of reasons, but it doesn't get to the problem I've highlighted. And that's because we can't start a good pattern of reasoning from the premise that you'll avoid getting wet. That's not a fitting response. So I don't think they give us the right story here on normative reasons because there's a problem with the starting point. And hence that led me to think about, well, then how do we need to tweak the account? I'm sympathetic with an overall reasoning account of normative reasons. I've elaborated some aspects of that in an earlier paper from 2019 on normative facts and reasons. But we need to be clearer on that link between fittingness and reasons than they are, and to be clearer how the link works such that we can preserve the tendency of reasons to compete. So that's what this linking principle that I develop in the paper is supposed to do. So before I comment on that, just a couple of explanations. So on my understanding, and theirs as well, normative reasons are propositions. They're not states of affairs. So a proposition, I take it, is the shareable content of favoring considerations, or generally, proposition is the shareable content of considerations. The relevant propositions here are favoring considerations. Propositions are the stuff we reason with, and the stuff then we can engage in shared reasoning together because of the shareable content. So normative reasons are propositions, and that means what they do for us is that they represent propositionally, if we take a fittingness priority of reasons, the fittingness relations in a given context. And so there's something I think that doesn't quite work in their reasoning account because they're not quite clear on the starting point, how it works, but it's clearer if we spell it out as saying what we need to do to get to normative reasons is represent in thought the fittingness relation that obtains in a given context. And that's the thought that the linking principle captures. So in a first approximation, we can say the linking principle holds that at least for some normative reasons, like I said, my account isn't fully comprehensive, unlike theirs. So I'm starting anyway with just this claim that it's for some normative reasons, for some proposition P to be a normative reason to do X, to do A in certain circumstances, is for that proposition to truly represent the fit-making facts in these circumstances. So in the pond example, that the child is at risk of drowning, I think, is a true representation of the fit-making fact of the response, the fitting response, rescuing the child. So that's the idea. That's what the linking principle captures. However, that's too narrow. This first approximation is too narrow, and it's too narrow because, as I said at the beginning, reasons are the sort of thing that apply across circumstances. They don't just apply in a given circumstance. They compete. So in the pond example, we also need to account for the fact that you have a reason not to rescue the child, which is that you'll avoid to get wet. So, and I already commented that not wanting to get wet is not a fitting starting point. So we need to tweak the linking principle in order to get to an account of a normative reason not to rescue the child, which is that you avoid getting wet. And that's what the second approximation tries to capture. And the thought is, for a proposition to be a normative reason, is for it to represent fit-making facts in some situation S that overlaps with the current circumstances. So that captures the idea that reasons apply across circumstances, whereas fittingness is, in a sense, a particular, is tethered to a particular situation. It's an overall notion that applies to a particular situation. It's not a contributory notion that applies across situations. So just a simple example I have in the paper. So helping a friend is a reason both in a standard benevolence case and in a standard corruption case. But of course, in a corruption case, helping a friend is not fitting. Right? So that's the difference. Reasons travel across situations, fittingness does not. So the revised linking principle tries to capture that. And it's because helping your friend is a true representation of fit-making facts, at least in some situations, which, as it happens, overlap with the corruption case. That's why it is a reason in the corruption case, as well as in the standard benevolence case, even though there's a difference. If we're just looking at the corruption case, then helping your friend is not fitting, but we can explain why you have a reason to help your friend, looking at other situation where helping your friend is fitting. Okay, so that's the second approximation that gives us a story that can account for competing reasons. It can give us, it can explain both why in the pond example you have a reason to rescue the child as well as a reason not to, because there are circumstances in which it is completely fitting to avoid getting wet. So that explains why in the pond example, where also there's a risk of getting wet, there's an overlap between situation where it's fitting to avoid getting wet. In the pond example, it's not, but the two overlap, so you have a reason to avoid getting wet. That competes with the obviously much weightier reason to rescue the child, which is that the child is at risk of drowning. Okay, so we have a fittingness priority view that explains the normativity of reasons in terms of fittingness, but allows for reasons to compete. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a common objection to all fittingness priority views, including the one I've just presented, is that a fittingness priority view is a non-starter because fittingness is only thinly normative. Doesn't give you the right kind of normativity. So the worry is that in sort of etiquette contexts, we might say that they are fitting responses, how to hold a fork at a dinner table, how to move chess pieces, right? But that's not the sort of normativity we're after when we're trying to explain the normativity of reasons, or when we try to explain normative reasons. Something's gone wrong. That's the objection. And I accept the objection for what I think is a standard view, is a common view of the standard of fittingness, which is an internal standard view. So on the internal standard view, what makes a response fitting depends on the type of response that it is. So what makes admiration fitting depends on admiration. What makes a belief fitting is internal to belief, if the internal standard of belief is truth, right? So it's truth that makes belief fitting, but the standard is internal to the attitude, to the belief. Same for admiration, etc. If we accept an internal standard view, then we run into this problem. Then it looks like we get, we water down normativity because there are all sorts of attitudes that might be fitting, all sorts of responses that might be fitting in a certain context, but not fitting in the sort of robustly normative sense that we're after, like it's fitting to rescue the child. So my response to this is we don't have to buy this internal standard view. I think it's the wrong view anyway. We should adopt an external standard view. And in other work, I'm developing that as a relational view of the standard of fittingness, which would give us robust normativity. It gives a story of what fitting responses are that doesn't run into this problem. So then we can rephrase the linking principle in this way to say that for robustly normative reasons, what we want is propositions P that truly represent in thought the fit-making facts in situations S that overlap with the one we're currently considering. Okay, so that's my linking principle, trying to shed light on the way in which normative reasons depend on fittingness and inherit their normativity from fittingness in the first instance. They're trying to represent in thought fit-making facts. And then we can reason with that stuff, right? Once we have those propositions, we can use them, play them out against each other, etc., to determine what we ought to do. Then a sort of reasoning account of the sort that McEwen-Way produce is fine. Good. So now to the problem. of runaway reasons. So first of all, what are runaway reasons and when do they occur? The possibility of runaway reasons is a direct implication of the way in which I described the linking principle. To some extent, it's the price which we pay for allowing for reasons to compete, because that means there are reasons that, although robustly normative, representing fit-making facts, fail to pick out the fitting response in a given situation. So in the pond example, I'd say the reason not to rescue the child, that you avoid getting wet, is a runaway reason. So a runaway reason is a robustly normative reason, because it's grounded in fit-making facts, that applies in a given situation, but that need not pick out the fitting response, such as the reason you have not to rescue the child. Now, not all is lost. Right? Deliberation might be able to help us to keep runaway reasons in check. Right? We might identify in the pond case quite easily that, of course, that reason that you have not to rescue the child is outweighed. So all is well. We can determine that overall what you ought to do is to rescue the child, and that's consistent with the fitting response, as I've postulated it is. It's to rescue the child. But deliberation might not always work. And I identified two scenarios in which deliberation will not help us with the desideratum of keeping runaway reasons in check. The first problem that I identify is relevant normative reasons, right kind of reasons, might not exist because we failed to represent them in thought. So my example in the paper is the sexism example, drawing sort of on Elizabeth Harman's work, right? So to consider someone in the time before sexism has been represented in thought as a reason, as a source of reasons not to act in this way, right? So I think sexism has only been properly represented in thoughts of in the 1960s or something, so astonishingly late, right? So assuming a scenario in which we have not represented in thought that sexism could make some responses unfitting, right? So we don't have relevant normative reasons at our disposal to help us keep sexism in check through our deliberation. So that's our first problem. And a second problem is that even when they exist, even if we have represented in thought relevant fit-making facts, the right kind of reason, the one that truly represents the fit-making facts that apply in a given situation, may be outweighed by runaway reasons. So one example is a camp style. Let's assume there are a million headaches kind of scenario where, let's assume the pond example is as it is, rescuing the child is the fitting response, let's assume. But let's assume you also, it occurs to you, what if I could save a million headaches, right? You might think, oh, my God, right? Then I ought to cure people of a million headaches. Given as I've set it up in this case, saving headaches, even saving a million headaches, is a runaway reason, but it might look as if it trumps the right kind of reason. And in the paper, then I also provide a hiring example as the sort of example or sort of scenario where these two problems sometimes work together, where perhaps we haven't appropriately represented in thought all relevant reasons. Envisage a hiring scenario pre-1960s or whenever it was, before sexism was appropriately represented in thought as a source of unfitting responses. But also the difficulty of weighing relevant reasons and identifying the right kind of reason, the one that gets you to the fitting response. So deliberation might not always work. And if deliberation doesn't work, then we're left with what I call the runaway reasons problem, So there's a possibility that there are right kind of reasons that apply in a given situation, as well as runaway reasons, and we don't know how to distinguish between the two. We don't know how to make sure that our deliberation about how overall we ought to respond is not sidetracked, derailed by runaway reasons. If we can't rule out that our deliberations do get derailed by runaway reasons, then this challenges the revised normative claim that normative reasons, as long as they're fittingness based, are the mark of the normative, and that's because of runaway reasons. It looks like then we have a possibility where reasons identify one response, how we overall ought to respond, but that response can be in conflict with the fitting response. So then we have a possible conflict between the normativity of reasons and the fittingness and fittingness, and that, I think, undermines the claim that reasons are the only mark of the normative. Thank you very much.